What's up? It's Marco, Sage of Soccer, and today I want to talk about clubs not releasing their players for the U20 World Cup. If you're unaware, Brian Gutierrez, Chris Brady, Jalen Neal, Paxten Aaronson, maybe Ricardo Pepi were not released for the U20 World Cup by their clubs. They're being forced to stay with their clubs and play with them, and I want to talk a bit about that. In the past, I've been very critical of teams, specifically in the MLS, for refusing to allow their players to play in these international competitions. But that was more because the CONCACAF U20 Championship was an opportunity to qualify for the Olympics. And I think the Olympics was going to be a big opportunity to get a lot of more eyes on the sport, especially from a casual market, ahead of the 2026 World Cup. And I thought that was really important for the growth of the sport, which is why I was so critical of those clubs. But with this, the U20 World Cup is only going to be viewed by hardcore fans. There's not going to be many casuals tuning in to watch the US U20 team play Ecuador's U20 team. So I think the benefit here is only going to be for the players and playing in a international competition against the best players in their age group. But it is against players of their age group, and I want to talk about if it would be more beneficial to play against the players in their age group or to play in real professional games. And this is something I've actually been wondering about. I've been going back and forth on it because when you look at some of the players like Brandon Craig, who's going to be a starting center back for the US at this tournament, I think it's easy to say it's better for him to be playing at the U20 World Cup than playing with the Philadelphia Union's second team in MLS Next Pro. But then you have somebody like a Jude Bellingham, who is still eligible for this competition, which is kind of crazy. I think there's nobody on the planet who's arguing that he should be at the U20 World Cup as opposed to helping Borussia Dortmund with their title charge. So first, I want to talk about the MLS players: Chris Brady, Brian Gutierrez, and Jalen Neal. With Chris Brady, I think there's a pretty good case that he should be staying with Chicago. He's going to be getting consistent playing time, consistent starts with Chicago, as opposed to the U20 World Cup, where he'd likely be backing up Gabriel Slonina. Now, he would still be playing in an international competition and getting that experience, and we'd probably give him a game against, let's say, Fiji in the group stage. But I think playing consistently in the MLS, getting time against pro players, would really help his development more than just going to a tournament to be on the bench. And I think that there's a good case to be made that Chicago's making the right decision for Brady's development, keeping him in Chicago. But what about his teammate, Brian Gutierrez? Well, after holding him back from the U20 World Cup for being too crucial to the team, Chicago immediately put him on the bench in a game in the MLS. So that's not off to a great start. He did get to play a lot in the US Open Cup game, but that's not the same thing as playing in a pro league. So I think if Brian Gutierrez is just going to be coming off the bench for Chicago, I'm not sure if he should have been held back. Because even if he'd be coming off the bench for the U20 team, that's still a great experience being able to play in a top international competition. And I think with Gutierrez, it's a bit tougher to say, especially if he continues to come off the bench for Chicago. Because if you hold back a player, it should be because they're a crucial player to their team, not just because you want to get somebody off the bench. And I'm not sure if Chicago's make the right decision with Brian Gutierrez. Then there's Jalen Neal. Like Brady, Neal is going to be starting a lot for LA Galaxy. He did come off the bench in their most recent game, but he has been a pretty consistent starter for them this season. But unlike Brady, he's also a core player to the US U20 team, and he'd be a consistent starter for them. So I think you have to factor in the great experience that he'd get at the U20 World Cup, where he'd be playing against, again, the top players of his age group. But that's just the top players of his age group. If he stays with LA Galaxy, he'd be playing against professional players, like men who are just really good at the game. Like you have to wonder if there's going to be any striker at this U20 World Cup who will become as good as Christian Benteke is and who he'll be playing against with DC United. So I think it's actually an interesting choice to have him go to the U20 World Cup or have him stay in MLS and develop in competitive games. But then, like, a question comes up, and how competitive are these games going to be? LA Galaxy are bad this year. They're near the bottom of the Western Conference, and they have virtually no chance of making the playoffs. So, if Neil stays and plays these games, are these really competitive games? I mean, there's no real pressure to do anything when you're not in the playoff race in a league with no relegation. Is it really going to be beneficial for him, or is he going to be playing glorified friendlies? This is kind of the same as if a Premier League team gives a guy a debut in the last game of the season. It's like, okay, I guess they played in a Premier League game, but it meant nothing. Chicago's in a bit of a better situation. They still have a chance to qualify for the playoffs, but if they lose a couple of games, then it's the same situation, and it's just a bunch of dead rubber games. And you have to wonder, is that one game against Fiji that Chris Brady would play as important as a bunch of meaningless games in the league without relegation? So I think it's an interesting thing to just observe there. But at the same time, even if it is a pointless game, it's still going to be against a high level of competition and other teams that are going to be trying their hardest. So again, it's something I could go back and forth on, because it is going to be a tough decision between whether it is better for someone like a Jalen Neal to stay with his club or to go to the U20 World Cup. It's kind of weird to me that it's the bottom dwellers of MLS who are keeping their players at their clubs. If Caleb Wiley, Cade Cowell, or Jack McGlynn had been held back, I think that would have been a lot more understandable. But instead, it's the teams who are basically playing for nothing at the current moment, which I think is pretty interesting to observe. Now, I think going back and forth on it, I'm leaning towards it would probably be better for Gutierrez and Neal to have been released for the U20 World Cup and Chris Brady to have stayed, but I think that I could go either way. I'd listen to either argument, and it's not cut and dry. I think it is a discussion worth having. Then what about Paxten Aaronson and Ricardo Pepi? Well, I want to start with Ricardo Pepi because his team, who I've gotten away with not learning how to pronounce, has been relegated, and he will likely be leaving them at the end of the season. He's only been there on loan from Augsburg. And, they are playing Ajax, but again, that's just dead rubber games, pointless. And if he was held back by the club, I'd be very disappointed. However, I think it's probably that he isn't going to be there because he's with the US senior team, which has been the case throughout this entire cycle. If the US goes really far in the U20 World Cup, it might interfere with getting training time with the actual senior team. So I think that's the reason why Ricardo Pepi isn't with this squad, though it would have been fun to see him play, but again, the Nations League is much more important than the U20 World Cup. Lastly, there's Paxten Aaronson. Frankfurt held him back, and in the league, Frankfurt are in a pretty weird situation. They're unlikely to qualify for European places, and they're in no danger of relegation. So, like with a lot of the other players I've been talking about, it's basically dead rubber games. Granted, dead rubber games in the Bundesliga, where it's actually a bit more likely for Aaronson to be able to play, which might be beneficial to him. But again, that's kind of like the conversation with Jalen Neal. However, there's a bit of a difference in that Frankfurt are in the DFB Pokal final. And this is a final which, if they win, not only do they get a trophy, they also qualify for Europe. So them having their best squad available it is justifiable, similar to if we hypothetically had McGlynn, Wiley, Cade Cowell held back. You could justify doing that by saying they're crucial to their team. And I think this is so important to Frankfurt that having their best squad available is very big for them. And Aronson has been playing a lot more for them recently. So I can understand why Frankfurt are keeping Paxten Aaronson there. And honestly, it's kind of good that they value Aaronson enough to allow him to make him stay because they think he's that important to the team, but there's not a real guarantee that he'd even play in the final. So again, I can understand it, but I'm not sure if it's the right decision for Paxten Aaronson development, as he would be a crucial player for the USU 20 team, and he'd still get a full preseason ahead of next year. And I don't think that playing in the Bundesliga would help him as much as opposed to, like I said before, a full preseason where he could really get a chance to make his impact on the team next year. And I don't know, but maybe it could help him acclimate to the Bundesliga. Maybe they could give him a start in a game that doesn't really mean much, and they could honestly still qualify for Europe. So it's tough to say, but I think it's at least justifiable. And I think with all of these players, that you can see the reason why they were held back, even though it would be really fun to watch them play at the U20 World Cup. So that's my thoughts on the clubs holding back the U20 players. And again, I'm really not sure what I even want to think about this because as a biased US fan, I'm obviously going to be disappointed that we're not going to have some stars like Jalen Neal and Paxten Aaronson. But I can understand how the clubs want to have them there, and it honestly could be better for their development playing against senior level competition as opposed to a youth competition. But yeah, that's all I've talked about. Let me know your thoughts on this because I really could go either way on this decision. I'm not really sure. And yeah, that's all I got to talk about. See ya.